The night my mother told the maître I was nobody, I was holding a pager that could summon a trauma team to the OR in under 4 minutes, and she didn't know it. And for the first time in 31 years, I let her find out the hard way. She didn't even glance at me. She tipped her chin toward the velvet rope the way you'd wave off a fly, and told the young man checking names against his tablet, "She's not on the list. She's just my ride tonight. She can wait by the coat check." The boy hesitated, looked down at his screen, looked back up at me, and that was the moment my lanyard caught the chandelier light. The one with the small gold medallion clipped beneath my name badge. The one that means Chief of Surgery. The one that means when that pager on my hip goes off, an entire floor of Toronto General clears a path. His face did something I will remember until the day I die. He went very still, the way people go still right before they apologize for something they didn't even do yet, and he said, "Dr. Sinclair, we have you seated at the head table. The foundation's been asking for you since 5. My mother laughed, a bright social laugh she does for company, and told him he must be confusing me with someone else. She didn't know that 31 years of being invisible had just run out the clock. But before I tell you about that night, you need to understand how we got there, and who ended up holding the bill when the silence finally broke. If you're somewheres in this story already, hit subscribe, because what happened in my mother's kitchen 4 months later is the part nobody saw coming. I grew up in Hamilton, in a narrow brick house 2 blocks off Barton Street, where the air always smelled faintly of the steel mills, even when the wind was blowing the other way. My father worked the floor at a machine shop that made parts for the auto plants, a job that ate his hands. By the time I was 10, his knuckles were permanently swollen, scarred white where metal shavings had opened him up over 20 years of 12-hour shifts. He believed in exactly one thing: if you couldn't hold it, weigh it, or sell it, it wasn't real. Grades on a report card weren't real. A ribbon from a science fair wasn't real. He said this to me directly the year I turned 11, the same week I'd built a working model hydroelectric turbine out of a coffee can, copper wire, and a bicycle dynamo for the regional science fair. The kind of thing that took me 6 weekends in the garage with frozen fingers because we didn't run the heater out there. I won first place in my division. I carried the little certificate home like it was made of glass. He looked at it for exactly as long as it takes to read 4 words, set down his coffee, and said, "Can't pay rent with a ribbon," and went back to the newspaper. He didn't ask how the turbine worked. He didn't ask how I'd figured out the gear ratio. I stood there for a long moment holding a piece of paper that had cost me 6 weeks of my childhood, and then I folded it in half and put it in my sock drawer, where it stayed for years. 3 minutes later, my sister came through the back door, holding a participation trophy from her house league soccer team over her head like she'd just won Olympic gold, and my mother dropped the dish towel she was holding and actually screamed with joy. She picked my sister up, 11 years old and getting too big to be picked up, and spun her around the kitchen until the dog started barking. That trophy went on the mantel that same night, dead center, where every visitor to the house would see it before they saw anything else in the room. I was standing 4 feet away holding a ribbon that had just been told it wasn't real. I learned that year what my role in the family was. I was the furniture, I was useful, load-bearing, and never, ever the centerpiece. That pattern held until I was 16, the year my father died of a heart attack on the shop floor, face down on the concrete before the ambulance even got the call. At the funeral home, my sister wept so completely and so photogenically that 2 aunts had to physically hold her up at the casket, and every single person who came through the receiving line went to her first, cupped her face, told her how strong she was being. I stood off to the side near the guest book with a calculator in my coat pocket because somebody had to work out how we were going to cover the $4,800 the funeral home wanted for the casket and the burial plot, and that somebody, at 16, was me. I negotiated the payment plan myself, standing in a hallway that smelled like lilies and carpet cleaner, because my mother couldn't get a sentence out without dissolving, and my sister was 14 and busy being comforted. That night I sat at our kitchen table until almost 3 in the morning, handwriting 40-some thank you cards to everyone who'd sent flowers or casseroles, because somebody needed to, and I lined them up on the counter in neat rows so my mother could mail them in the morning. When I came downstairs the next day, the cards were gone, swept into a green garbage bag along with the junk mail. Because my mother needed the counter space for the casserole dishes, people kept dropping off for my sister, so she has something solid to eat. She's so fragile right now. Nobody had read a single card. I didn't say anything. I'd already learned that saying something cost more than it ever bought back. When I was 18, I got my acceptance letter into the 6-year direct entry medicine program at McMaster, a full lieutenant governor's scholarship covering tuition, no OSAP debt, the kind of acceptance rate that makes guidance counselors frame the form letter on their office wall. I'd spent the better part of grade 12 studying in the school library after hours because our house was too loud and too small to think in. working a part-time job at the Shoppers Drug Mart on weekends to save for textbooks, getting up at 5 to run before school because I'd read that medical schools liked to see discipline outside the classroom too. I brought the acceptance letter home in a manila envelope I'd flattened under my mattress overnight so it would look crisp, and I set it on the kitchen table and waited, hands folded, the way you wait for a verdict. My mother was clipping coupons. She picked the letter up between two fingers, read the first paragraph, and set it back down without finishing it. "So you're going to be one of those doctors nobody can get an appointment with," she said. "Don't expect us to brag about it at Christmas. Your sister's already nervous enough about her grades without you showing off." My sister, 17 by then, and sprawled on the couch texting, snorted without even looking up. I should have screamed at both of them. Instead, the same calculation ran through my head that always ran through my head. Don't take up room, don't cast a shadow, let her have all the light. It costs you less in the long run. I folded the letter back into the envelope and never mentioned it again until the day I left for residency. What followed were the years I genuinely do not like remembering, because I was the one footing the bill for the family while being treated like an inconvenience in it. My sister married a man, my brother-in-law, who never met a get-rich plan he didn't fall for, and by their third year of marriage, they were sliding into the kind of debt where the phone rings during dinner. I was a second-year surgical resident making not very much money at all, working 100-hour weeks, sleeping in on-call rooms more nights than I slept in my own bed, and somehow I was also the one wiring $800 to cover their mortgage when it came up short. The one paying my mother's property tax bill in Hamilton 2 years running, 'cause the market's been hard, you understand, you're doing so well now. Nobody asked what doing well actually cost me. Nobody asked about the malpractice insurance premiums, or the loans for my surgical fellowship in Vancouver, or the fact that I hadn't taken a vacation in 4 years because every dollar I didn't absolutely need went home. I kept paying because some calcified part of me still believed that if I just gave enough, eventually it would register. Eventually somebody would look up from the trophy on the mantle and notice the person who'd been holding the family up the entire time. It never did. My sister introduced me at her own wedding as my sister, she's in healthcare, the same flattening phrase she used at every family gathering for the next decade, as if I refilled prescriptions at the Rexall instead of running trauma codes at 2 in the morning. I want to be clear that I wasn't a saint about any of it, not entirely. I let it happen because being needed, even being used, felt like a kind of love when you'd spent your whole childhood being furniture. There's a particular flavor of cowardice in being competent. You tell yourself that handling it quietly is strength, when really it's just fear wearing a badge. By the time I turned 38, I had spent 14 years in trauma and general surgery, the last 3 as deputy chief, and that winter the hospital board appointed me chief of surgery, the youngest in the hospital's history, and one of very few women to hold the post in the city at the time. It came with a corner office I never had time to sit in, a seat on the hospital foundation's executive board, and, that February, an invitation to chair the foundation's annual gala at the Royal York, the single biggest fundraising night of the year for the trauma wing I'd helped redesign. I told my mother about the appointment over the phone, flatly, the way you report a fact rather than offer a gift, because by then I'd stopped expecting her to catch it and run with it. She said, "That's nice, honey, listen, your sister's having a rough month, do you think you could?" And I transferred $400 before she even finished the sentence, the way I always did, because saying no had never once worked out better than saying yes. When the gala came around, my mother asked to come as my guest. My sister and her husband too, all 3 of them, since my sister's husband had a few contacts there he wanted to network with, which should have told me everything I needed to know about how the evening would go. I should have said no. I said yes, because some stubborn, exhausted part of me still wanted them to see the room I'd built, the foundation check I'd be presenting on stage that night, the trauma wing with my name on the donor wall plaque. I wanted one more time for them to see me in a frame instead of standing outside it. We arrived at the hotel together, the 4 of us, my mother in a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, talking the entire ride over about how my brother-in-law should work the room early before the open bar got too crowded. I'd left my badge clipped under my coat out of habit, hospital security policy. You don't walk around the city flashing hospital credentials, but I never took my coat off at the door, because the coat check line was long, and my mother was already 3 steps ahead of me, moving toward the check-in table like she owned the room. That's when it happened. The young volunteer at the table, a McMaster nursing student doing it for the community service hours, I'd find out later, looked up the guest list for 4 names and found 3. My mother, not waiting for me to even open my mouth, told him I wasn't on the list, that I was just her ride for the evening, that he could let me wait by the coats. And that's when my coat slipped open enough for the lanyard to catch the light, and the boy's face changed, And he said the words that ended 31 years of being told I wasn't real. My mother laughed it off in front of him. She actually laughed, told him he had the wrong idea, that I worked in healthcare, her usual line, the one that had covered for 14 years of trauma surgery and a chief's appointment like it was a part-time job folding towels at a clinic. The hospital CEO came over personally inside of 90 seconds because the chair of the gala not being recognized at her own event by her own table staff was the kind of thing that gets fixed fast, and he greeted me by title in front of my entire family, Dr. Sinclair, we've been holding the head table for you. And I watched my mother's face do something I had genuinely never seen it do before. It went blank, and then it went red, and then, for the first time in my adult life, it went quiet. I won't pretend the rest of the evening was some clean, satisfying turn where everyone groveled and I floated through on vindication. It was awkward and overdressed, and my brother-in-law spent the cocktail hour trying to recover by telling a circle of cardiologists about a real estate deal he was this close to closing, and my sister kept her eyes on her phone, and my mother sat through the dinner program, through the video about the trauma, through the moment I stood up to accept the foundation's recognition for the department's outcomes that year. With the stunned, hollowed-out look of someone doing math she should have done a long time ago. She didn't say a word to me on the cab ride home. None of them did. It was 4 months later, in March, that the rest of it came apart, in the kitchen of the Hamilton house I'd grown up in, the one I'd quietly been covering the property taxes on without ever being thanked for it. My mother called and asked me to come by, not to fix anything financially this time, just to come, and when I got there, she had the table cleared and a small wooden box sitting in the middle of it, the kind of cigar box my father used to keep odds and ends in, the one I hadn't seen since he died. She said she'd found it in the back of the hall closet, while she was clearing things out to sell the house. The bank had been sending letters. The mortgage she'd refinanced years ago to bail my sister and her husband out one more time had finally caught up with her, and she was looking for anything worth pawning. Instead, she'd found this. Inside the box, under a layer of old receipts and a broken pocket watch, was my science fair certificate. The one from the hydroelectric turbine, the one he'd told me wasn't real, the one I'd folded into my sock drawer 30 years earlier and forgotten I'd ever taken out again, except he had taken it. At some point, without a word to anyone, he'd taken it out of my drawer, smoothed the fold out as best he could, and laminated it. Sitting beside it was a single sheet of machine shop scrap metal, no bigger than a playing card, that he'd clearly worked himself, bent, ground smooth at the edges. The kind of careful labor my father only ever gave to things that mattered to him. With 5 words stamped into the surface in uneven capital letters, the work of a man who'd never learned to say a tender thing out loud in his life. Margax built the light herself. My mother's voice broke on every second word as she told me she'd found it 3 weeks before, that she'd sat with it alone for those 3 weeks, not knowing how to bring it to me, that she'd always believed my father simply didn't care. Because that was the story that let her off the hook for caring so loudly about my sister instead. He never told me, she said. He let me think he felt the same way I did. He let me believe it was fine to treat you the way I did. She put both hands flat on the table to steady herself and asked me the question that finally cracked 31 years open in one breath. Why did you let me do that to you? Why didn't you ever make me stop? I sat down across from her, and for the first time since I was 11 years old, I let myself answer honestly instead of usefully. Because I learned early that the only way to be safe in this family was to take up as little room as possible. I taught you that I didn't need anything, so you stopped checking whether I did. That's not entirely your fault, but it's not entirely mine either. There was no triumph in saying it. There wasn't supposed to be. Both of us sat with the wreckage of it at the same time. The years of casseroles that went to one daughter and calculators that went to the other, the trophy on the mantel and the certificate in a sock drawer, the love that got spent entirely in one direction, because nobody ever made it cost anything to keep doing that. Neither of us was innocent. Neither of us was only guilty. Things didn't fix themselves overnight, because that isn't how 31 years works, but something genuinely shifted after that afternoon. At Easter, when the whole family was back at the house, I noticed the mantel was bare. My sister's old trophies and ribbons, the ones that had lived there since we were kids, all gone, the wall behind them freshly patched and painted. My sister was the one who'd done it. I found out later, without telling anyone, the week after our mother told her what had been in that cigar box. In their place hung a single frame holding 2 things, the laminated certificate, and beside it, mounted on a small wooden plaque, the scrap of metal my father had stamped by hand. My sister hung it herself, standing on a kitchen chair with a level and a box of nails she clearly didn't know how to use properly, her hands shaking the entire time, not from the effort. When she stepped down, she didn't say anything clever, didn't make it about herself the way she always had. She just poured water into my glass at dinner with both hands and sat there with her head down for most of the meal. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, my brother-in-law didn't mention a single business deal all night. Before dinner, my mother stood up at the head of the table, gripping the back of her chair to steady herself, and said the thing out loud that I'd waited 31 years to hear. This is my daughter. She runs the surgical department that saved your cousin's life 2 years ago, the one none of us bothered to ask her about at the time. For most of her life, I made her feel like she was furniture in this family, and I was wrong, every single time. I'm asking her to sit at the center of this table tonight, and I'm asking the rest of you to finally see her the way I should have seen her from the start. It wasn't a long speech. It didn't need to be. It filled a space that had taken 3 decades to carve out and only about 30 seconds to finally name properly. A few weeks after that, alone in my office at the hospital late one night, charting after a 12-hour case, I caught my reflection in the dark window over the parking garage and thought about the whole arc of it: the ribbon, the trophy, the cigar box, the mantle. The hardest lesson of my career had nothing to do with anything I'd learned in an operating room. It was this: people will respect your title because policy requires it, and they'll follow your orders because that's how a surgical team functions. But being actually seen, that only happens when the people who are supposed to love you choose, deliberately and at some cost to themselves, to put down what they wanted to believe and look at who you really are instead. Sacrifice without a boundary doesn't earn you gratitude. More often, it just teaches the people around you that your generosity is a resource, free for the taking, with no bottom to it. That was the most expensive thing I ever learned, and I paid for it in decades of being the one who held the family together while standing just outside the photograph. If any part of this sounds like your own life, I want you to hear this part most of all. The people who love you the way you deserve will not need a gold seal on a badge to finally notice you're in the room.